The first thing about him was the dust on his coat, and the second was the way he did not brush it off. He came down the switchback trail above the Calloway place on a bay gelding with a scar across its shoulder, the September sun laying long gold over the San Juan range at his back, and he rode the last half-mile at a walk because the horse was tired and because he was in no hurry to be seen. 42 years old, 6 feet even, weathered brown from sun and wind, a jaw that had been broken once and healed a little crooked, dark hair going gray above the ears, gray eyes that had learned early to notice things and later to keep quiet about what they noticed. He wore a canvas duster the color of wet sand, a faded blue shirt buttoned to the throat, and boots that had walked more miles than most men rode. His name was Wade Harker, though nobody on that ridge would learn it for 2 full days, and by then it would not matter what he was called because they would already know what he was for. The Calloway Ranch sat in a bowl of grass 40 miles north of Durango, 1,800 acres of good pasture and bad fence, 112 head of cattle when there ought to have been 300, a barn that leaned 3 degrees south of true, and a 2-story homestead built by a man who was no longer alive to see it lean with it. Thomas Calloway had died on the 2nd day of April, throwing a rope on a cow that did not want to be roped, and now, 5 months later, his widow Ellen and his daughter Sarah were doing the work of 4 men with the hands of 2 women, and losing. The mountains north of them held their first thin skiff of snow already on the upper cirques, and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun to turn. A slow, uneven, ragged yellow that ran from the crown down, 1 branch at a time, the way a season turns when nobody is watching it turn. Sarah Calloway was 26 years old, 5'7", chestnut hair braided down her back and pinned twice because loose hair got caught on things, brown eyes the color of the creek in November, a face that had been called pretty in Durango dance halls and was now called tired by anyone honest. She wore her mother's blue calico dress with the long sleeves buttoned at the wrists, a canvas apron over it, black boots her father had bought her the winter she turned 19. She could shoot a rifle, saddle a horse, and read a ledger, and she had done all 3 that morning before breakfast. She could also, when the day required it, sit on the top step of the porch after supper with her mother and neither of them speak for an hour and both of them feel, at the end of that hour, a little less broken than at the start. That was a skill too, though it was not the kind you put in a ledger. Her mother Ellen was 51, gray already, quieter than she had been, and the 2 of them had made a working arrangement of silence that let the days pass without either of them saying the thing they both knew, which was this: the ranch had 90 days. 90 days, and then the note held by Silas Beaumont at the Durango Cattlemen's Bank came due, and there was not enough money in the ranch or in the bank or in the sky to pay it. They had gone over the numbers twice on a Tuesday at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the ledger open between them, and both times the numbers had said the same thing in the same quiet voice. They were $912 short. They had, if the calves fattened and the market held, perhaps 400 coming in November. They had, if a miracle rode down out of the mountains, the difference. They had never in their lives put much stock in miracles. Thomas Calloway had built the ranch on the theory that miracles were for men who had not yet learned to swing a hammer, and he had passed that theory to his daughter along with everything else. Wade Harker rode into the yard on the 11th of September, and Sarah was on the roof of the barn. She had climbed up there to nail down a sheet of tin that had come loose in the last wind, and she was hammering with her left hand because her right wrist was still stiff from a fall 3 weeks back, and she saw him before he saw her. A man on a bay horse, coming slow, no rifle showing, hat pulled low. She palmed the little derringer in her apron pocket and waited. The wind had died in the last quarter hour and the afternoon had gone very still, the way an afternoon goes still in the high country when a change is coming that only the animals have noticed yet. Down in the corral one of the maras lifted her head and turned her ears toward the trail, and Sarah, watching from the ridgeline of the barn roof, watched the mare and knew the rider was still a quarter mile out before she saw the rider herself. He stopped 10 yards from the porch, took his hat off and said to the house, "Ma'am, I saw your barn from the ridge. That tin's going to come off in the next wind and take a piece of the roof with it. I'd be obliged for a night's feed for my horse. I'll fix your roof for the trouble." He said it to the front door because that was where a woman would be. He did not look up. He did not know Sarah was on the roof, and later she would tell her mother that this was the thing she noticed first, that he asked the empty house instead of shouting for the yard, that he offered work before food, that he did not once say the word please as if it were a debt she owed him for existing. Ellen Calloway came out on the porch with her father's shotgun broken open over her arm, and she looked at the man for a long, quiet count, and then she said, "The tins on the north slope. Ladders inside the barn." And she went back into the house. That was the whole hiring. By sundown the tin was nailed down in 12 places instead of the 4 Sarah had managed. The loose board on the north wall of the barn had been reset. The sagging hasp on the tackroom door had been rehung so it closed square, and Wade Harker had eaten a plate of beans and cornbread on the porch step without coming inside, and had unrolled his bedroll in the tackroom without being asked. He had watered his horse at the trough, and then he had run a currycomb over the animal for a long half-hour, working out the trail dust in slow, patient circles, murmuring low, and Sarah had watched him from the kitchen window and said nothing, because a woman who has lived on a ranch her whole life knows that the way a man cares for a horse is the way he will care for everything else, given time and given room. Ellen said, at the kitchen table, "He'll be gone tomorrow." Sarah said, "Maybe." She said maybe because she had watched him with the hammer, and she had seen a thing she could not name yet, which was that he swung it the way a man swings a tool he has swung his whole life, and he set each nail without looking at the head, and when he was done he ran his hand along the seam of the tin the way a man runs his hand along the neck of a horse he has broken. He touched work the way other men touched what they loved. And Sarah, who had lost her father in April and had not touched anything with love since, noticed. He did not leave in the morning. He came out of the tackroom before first light and stood in the yard looking at the barn, and then at the corral, and then at the fence line that ran west toward the creek, and by the time Sarah came out with the milk bucket the corral gate had a new hinge on it and the split rail she had meant to replace for 2 weeks was replaced. The wood was cottonwood, still pale and pink at the fresh cut, and he had shaped the top of the rail with a draw knife so the rain would run off it and not soak into the grain the way it had soaked into the old one. He had done all this in the dark, working by feel, and he had not woken the dogs. The old blue heeler that had followed Thomas Calloway for 9 years had, in fact, come out of the barn behind Wade with her tail low and her ears easy, which was a thing she had done for exactly one man in her life, and that man had been buried in April. She said, "From the porch step you did that in the dark." He said, "There was moon enough." She said, "We can't pay you." He said, "I didn't ask." And he walked past her toward the barn with a coil of wire over his shoulder. And that was the second day. The trouble began on the third day, because the trouble was already there and had only been waiting for a witness. His name was Silas Beaumont. He was 58 years old, a banker out of Durango, a landowner of some 4,000 acres that touched the Calloway west boundary along Rock Creek. A soft-spoken man who wore a black frock coat in September because he believed a man's clothing was a promise of his character. He had loved Ellen Calloway once, 20 years back, and she had chosen Thomas, and Silas had never quite stopped calculating what that had cost him. He was not a cruel man. He was worse than a cruel man. He was a reasonable one. He rode up to the Calloway porch at 10 in the morning on the 13th of September, and he brought a paper with him, and he said, "Ellen, I've come with a fair offer. The bank's willing to forgive the note in exchange for the west section. 2,000 acres. That's a generous number, and I'd like you to consider it before the deadline forces something less kind on both of us. It's in your best interest, and in Sarah's." He said Sarah's name the way a man tests the give of a rope. Ellen said, "I'll think on it, Silas." He said, "Please do. I'd hate to see a lifetime of Thomas's work go for auction." He tipped his hat. He rode out slow. He did not raise his voice once. He never raised his voice. It was, Sarah thought, watching him go, the most dangerous thing about him, that he had learned, somewhere, that the man who never raises his voice is presumed to be the man who is right. Her father had never trusted him. Her father had said once, at this same kitchen table, that Silas Beaumont was the sort of man who would take your last dollar and hand you back a receipt and expect gratitude for the paper. Sarah had laughed at the time. She was not laughing now. Wade Harker was at the corner of the barn stripping a length of oak for a new fence post, and he had heard every word. He did not look up when Silas rode past. He did not look up when Ellen went back inside. He set the draw knife against the wood and pulled a long clean shaving off it, and when Sarah came around the corner 10 minutes later with a question in her mouth he said, before she asked it, "That's the man who holds the note." She said, "How did you know?" He said, "I've met him 3 times. Different name each time. Same coat." He did not explain further. He set another shaving off the post. The shavings curled at his feet like pale, dry woodflowers, and he did not sweep them. That night Sarah asked him, on the porch, with the lamp between them and the moths worrying the glass, what he had done before. And Wade Harker, who had been a Union cavalryman at Chickamauga and a foreman on the XIT and a widower for 11 years and a father to a boy who had died of scarlet fever at the age of 6, said only, "I've done a little of most things. None of it worth telling twice." She did not push. She had learned, from her father, that some men handed you their history in installments and some men handed it to you once, at the end, and you did not choose which. She said, "There's a fence along the creek that's been down since May." He said, "I saw it." She said, "The cattle drift through. We lose 2, 3 a month to Beaumont's range." He said, "I know." He was already fixing it in his head. She could see him doing it, the way a man mentally lays out a piece of work before his hands touch it. She said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because it needs doing." And then, after a long minute, in a voice softer than she had heard from him, "And because I remember what it's like to be behind on a thing you love." He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the moths on the glass. But he said it, and she heard it, and something inside her chest that had been closed since April opened half an inch and did not close again. The fence took him 9 days. 2 miles of split rail and wire along the creek, replaced pole by pole, and he did it without asking for a hand and without accepting one when Sarah rode out on the 4th day to try. She watched him for an hour from a cottonwood on the near bank, and then she rode back to the house and told her mother, "He works like he's paying somebody back." Ellen said, "For what?" Sarah said, "I don't know yet. A man who works like that," her mother said without looking up from the peas she was shelling, "is either running toward a thing or away from one," and in her experience the two looked the same from the outside and only the man ever knew the difference, and sometimes not even him. Sarah did not answer. She stood at the kitchen window and watched a long ragged line of geese come down the sky above the mountains, calling, and she thought about how a person could arrive at a place the same way, from a great height, tired, in formation with nothing but their own weather, and land because the land looked, from above, like a place a bird could rest. She would not know for 2 more months. She would find out on a cold night in November on a porch with a lamp between them and no moths left because it was too cold for moths, and by then she would already have decided, in the quiet interior way a woman decides these things, that whatever he was paying back she was willing to help him carry the balance for as long as it took. By the 22nd of September, the west line was tight. The cattle had stopped drifting. Wade Harker had lost 8 pounds and gained a callus on the inside of his right thumb that he rubbed absently in the evenings, and he had not said more than 40 words in a day since the porch conversation, and Sarah had begun to leave a second cup of coffee on the porch rail at first light because he came out and drank it without being told to, and she had begun to like the shape of that small unspoken thing more than she wanted to admit. He drank it black. He set the empty cup on the rail upside down when he was done, always, so the dew would not gather in it overnight. It was such a small, considered thing that Sarah, the first morning she noticed, had stood at the kitchen window with a hand on the sill and had not been able to look away from the upturned cup for a full minute. That is how a person who has been alone a long time thinks. They do not think about themselves. They think about the cup and the dew and the next hand that will lift it. Sarah had thought her father was the only man in the county who thought that way, and she had buried her father in April, and here on the porch rail on the 23rd of September was a second upturned cup, and she did not know yet what to do with the fact of it. Then, on the 24th of September, they found the first dead calf. It was in the north pasture, its throat cut, its brand cut out of the hide with a knife. Not wolves. Not weather. A message. Wade stood over it for a long time, and then he squatted down and picked up a spent brass shell from the grass and rolled it between his fingers. And he said, without looking up, "It's a Sharps. Beaumont's foreman carries a Sharps." Sarah said, "You've seen it?" He said, "I saw it on the porch on the 13th. Under his coat on the offside. A man doesn't ride to a widow's house with a rifle under his coat unless he wants her to notice it without saying so." He put the shell in his pocket. He stood up. He said, "How long till your note comes due?" She said, 64 days. He said, "Then we've got 64 days to make this ranch worth more standing than sold." She said, "How?" He said, "By making it clear it's not for sale at any price he's willing to pay. And by making sure the next calf we lose is his." He did not smile when he said it. He said it the way a man reads the weather. And then he added, quieter, half to himself and half to the calf on the grass. I have buried enough small things in my life. I do not intend to bury this ranch too. Sarah heard him. She did not answer. She turned her horse and rode back toward the house, and by the time she had crossed the creek she had made a decision she did not know she had made until later, which was that she would not, from that morning forward, let this man carry any weight of the Calloway ranch alone. Whatever came next, they would carry it too. The next 6 weeks were the longest and the shortest of Sarah's life. Wade Harker turned the ranch inside out. He culled the herd down to the 70 strongest, drove the rest to the fall market in Pueblo with Sarah riding beside him and Ellen holding down the house, and came back with enough cash to make 1 interest payment and a written contract with a stockyard buyer named Halloran who had known Thomas Calloway and who agreed, on Wade's handshake, to take the spring calves at $8 over the going rate because Wade told him plainly that the alternative was watching a good ranch fall to a bad man, and Halloran had opinions about bad men. Wade rebuilt the corral, using cedar this time because he said cedar would still be standing when the two of them were not. He put a new window in the east wall of the kitchen, a square one, framed in cottonwood, and when Ellen asked him why the east wall he said, so you'd have good light for the sewing in the morning. You do it in the north window now and squint. Ellen did not answer him. She went out onto the porch and stood a while with her back to the house, and Sarah found her later with her hand still on the porch rail and her eyes wet, and Ellen said only, your father used to say he'd put a window there. He never did. Sarah did not tell Wade. Her mother had cried. She did not need to. He knew. And in the middle of all this, in the middle of the hauling and the culling and the mending, the small thing between them grew, unannounced, the way grass grows in a fence corner where no one is watching. He fixed the loose board on her bedroom floor that had woken her every night since June, and he did it while she was in town, and she came home and stepped on it and there was no sound, and she stood in the doorway of her own room for a full minute and did not know why she was crying until she did. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. There was a third scene, and Sarah remembered it later as the one that finally undid the last small clothes thing inside her. It was a Sunday in the middle of October, and she found Wade at the far corner of the north pasture. Sitting on his heels beside a cairn of river stones, her father had built 10 years back to mark the spot where he had lost his best horse to a rattlesnake. Wade was not fixing anything. He was clearing weeds from around the base of the cairn with the point of his knife, slow, careful, the way a man clears the space around a headstone. He had gathered a small handful of the late aster blooms that grew wild on the pasture edge, purple and low, and he had laid them across the top stone. He did not hear her ride up. When he did, he stood, and he said only, your father marked this. I thought it was going to grass. Somebody ought to know it was here. He had not asked whose stones. He had known. He had learned this place the way a man learns a person, by paying attention when the person is not looking. Sarah did not dismount. She did not speak. She sat her horse a long time, and she looked at the aster blooms on the stone, and after a while she turned the horse around and rode home the long way through the cottonwoods, because she needed the ride to become steady enough to walk into her own kitchen. By the 18th of November there was snow on the peaks and a cold wind coming down the draw, and Silas Beaumont came back. He rode up alone this time in the same black coat, and he stopped at the west fence line where Wade Harker was setting the last brace on the new gate, and he did not dismount, and he said, Mr. Harker. Wade said, Mr. Beaumont. Silas said, you've done a considerable amount of work here. Wade said, it needed doing. Silas said, the Calloway women are fortunate. Not every drifter would put such care into a place that isn't his. Wade set the brace. He tapped it home with the flat of his hand. He said, it's not mine. That doesn't mean it's yours. Silas smiled a small, tired, reasonable smile. He said, the note comes due on the 22nd of December. 34 days. I don't believe 70 head and a handshake with Halloran will cover it. I've done the arithmetic. I do it for a living. Wade said, so have I. Silas said, then you know. Wade said, I know what the arithmetic says. I also know that a man who cuts a calf's throat to make a point has already lost the argument. The county knows what a sharp's shell looks like too, Mr. Beaumont. And your foreman's the only sharps in 40 miles. Silas's face did not change. It did not need to. He said quietly, that is a serious accusation. Wade said, It's not an accusation. It's a piece of brass in my pocket, and a letter I mailed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver 11 days ago. And a stockman named Halloran in Pueblo who has agreed to testify to what your foreman told him in a saloon in October. It's an accusation when I say it out loud. Right now it's just a fence I'm building. But I can say it out loud any day of the week. Silas Beaumont was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved in the cottonwoods along the creek, and the leaves that were left made a dry, small sound. And Silas, who had not been a cruel man, only a reasonable one, discovered the thing that reasonable men discover late. That reason is a thin coat in a cold country. He said, "What do you want, Mr. Harker?" Wade said, "I want the note extended 18 months at the same interest in writing signed today. I want your foreman off your payroll by Monday. And I want you to ride off this fence line and not put your horse on Callaway grass again unless a Callaway invites you." Silas said, "And in exchange?" Wade said, "In exchange, the piece of brass stays in my pocket. And the letter I mailed to Denver never gets a second one." Silas Beaumont looked at him a long time. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning that most fights were arithmetic and could be won by patience and paper, and he had just met the one fight that was not. He drew a breath. He let it out. He said, "You should know, Mr. Harker, that I have a granddaughter in Denver, and a name my grandfather earned in the war, and I do not care to see either of them in a marshal's file. So I will sign what you ask, and I will sign it today. But I would like it noted, between us, that I loved Ellen Callaway a long time before you rode down that ridge. It did not make me right. It made me slow. There is a difference, and I will thank you to remember it. And I will thank you further to know that firing my foreman costs me a man I have trained for 11 years, and I will feel that loss for the rest of the year, and I am willing to feel it because you are not wrong about the shell, and I did not know until this hour that he had gone that far in my name." Wade did not answer him for a full minute. When he did, he said, "Noted, Mr. Beaumont. Sign the papers. And know that I believed you when you said you did not know. There is a difference between the two of us, and it is that difference and no other. Good day." Silas said, "At last, you are a hard man, Mr. Harker." Wade said, "I'm a tired one. Same thing looks different from the outside." Silas turned his horse. He rode 10 yards. He stopped. He said, over his shoulder, without turning his head, "Tell Ellen I'm sorry. About Thomas. I never said it proper." Wade said, "Tell her yourself in a letter. She reads them all." Silas rode on. He signed the extension the next morning in the Durango Bank in his own hand, and he fired his foreman by the end of the week, and he did not come back to the Callaway West fence for the rest of his life. He wrote Ellen the letter in March, and she read it once and put it in the drawer with Thomas's, and that was the whole of that. That night, the night of the fence line conversation, Sarah was on the porch when Wade came up from the creek. He had washed at the pump. His hair was wet. He looked, she thought, older than she had noticed him being. She said, "You could have told us." He said, "I could have. I didn't want you carrying it if it didn't work." She said, "And if it hadn't worked?" He said, "Then I'd have carried it alone. That's what a man is for." She said, "Is that what you believe?" He said, "It's what I've done. Belief comes later." She said, "Wade." She had never used his given name before. She had waited 2 months for a moment that would not be ordinary, and this was it, and she used it. "Why did you stop here?" He was quiet a while. He looked out past the barn at the mountains, which were black against a black sky, and he said, "I had a boy. He would have been 22 this fall. I lost him when he was 6, and his mother the winter after. I've been walking since." He paused. "I saw your barn from the ridge, and I saw a woman on the roof hammering with her left hand, and I thought, that's a person who is losing something. And I have been losing something for 11 years. And I thought maybe I could stop losing it here." She did not say anything for a while. She reached out. She put her hand on the back of his on the porch rail. She left it there. She said, "Stay." He said, "I was going to." They were quiet after that. The lamp burned low. A coyote called once, up on the ridge, and another answered from the creek. And then the night was quiet again. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. They were married on the 4th of May, at the little Methodist church in Durango, with Ellen holding a bouquet of wild iris and Halloran the stockman standing as Wade's witness because Wade had no family left living and Halloran said he'd be honored. And Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress with the long sleeves let out an inch at the wrists because Ellen was smaller-boned. And afterward they rode back to the ranch and Ellen made a supper of chicken and dumplings and they ate it on the porch, because the kitchen was still too warm from the stove. The following spring the herd came in at 138 head, and Halloran paid 8 over as promised, and the note was current, and the west fence held, and the east window in the kitchen caught the morning light exactly the way Wade had said it would. Ellen sat in it, in the mornings, and did her sewing there for the rest of her life. Sarah stood at the window on a morning in October, a year and a month after Wade Harker had first come down the ridge, and she watched him out by the corral working a young horse in slow circles, and she said, aloud to no one, the cowboy saved her family ranch. But she saved something inside him. She said it the way you say a thing that has already come true. And that is the story of the Callaway Ranch, and of the man who rode down from the San Juan Range on the 11th of September with dust on his coat, and did not brush it off because he had walked 11 years to earn the right to leave it there. A ranch is only wood and grass and wire. What holds it up is not the fence. It is the hands that mend the fence, and the hands that leave coffee on the rail, and the years those hands spend learning to trust each other in the dark. That is the whole of it, and it does not take a bigger word. If you found something in this story that felt like your own, the losing, the mending, the way a good and quiet person can walk down a ridge and change the shape of a life, stay with us. Next time on Frontier Hearts, a widowed schoolteacher in a cold Montana town takes in a wounded stranger during the worst winter of 1887, and discovers that the man she has been feeding has been carrying her late husband's letter in his coat for 2,000 miles. Until next time, keep riding.